Pranam Dar, good afternoon, and welcome to the latest of the Wizard seminar series, which today is going to focus on homelessness data and homes administrative data linkage. And we're very, very lucky to have Dr. Ian Thomas giving the presentation, who is a wonderful colleague of mine. And for those that don't know me, I'm Pete Mackey. I'm a reader in School of Geography and Planning, also at Cardiff, and Ian is my statistical hero. We are joined by other statistical heroes of mine. I can see a few faces, but we've been on a long journey together, about kind of more than 12 years, I think, together, bringing homelessness data to answer questions about how we might end homelessness. So I'm really looking forward to Ian's presentation. The way we'll run it is pretty standard. Ian's going to give a kind of about 45 minute presentation, and then we'll open to questions rather than taking questions as we go. But if you do want to pop questions into the chat as we go, that's great. We can collate them. And then at the end, we'll just do it in a nice informal way. We're kind of, in terms of numbers, it's enough that you can just put up your hand. We'll be able to see you take the questions, and I'll also draw anything from the chat. So Ian, without further ado, over to you.
Thank you for the introduction. Today I'm going to give an overview of some of the work that ADR Wales have done in using administrative data. We have a package of work related to homelessness with various elements. So there's homelessness, health, homelessness and education, and some methodological projects related to the use of homelessness data. So I'm going to structure this around, firstly, I'm going to look at the policy landscape and how data fits within that landscape. Then I'm going to look at ADR Wales and specifically how we've gone about collecting data for me to analyse. Then I'm going to go through some of the findings of 5 of the different projects, pieces of work that we've done using this data. And then I'm just going to sum up at the end about where admin data could fit into the policy landscape. So this is the vision for homelessness in Wales, and this is cobbled together from various different documents that relate to homelessness produced by Welsh Government. So in general, they want homelessness to be a rare experience, and if it does occur, then the aim is for it to be brief and non-recurrent, so as short as possible, and for it to not occur again. So that's about having stable housing solutions. In order to achieve that vision, then the sort of framework of policies around that have emerged from the different documents. So in the programme for government, Welsh Government suggests that they want to fundamentally reform homelessness to focus on earlier prevention and rapid rehousing. So that obviously addresses the making homelessness brief, and the earlier prevention is about making it a rare experience. And then in the latest document that they've released, so Ending Homelessness, a high-level action report, they again reiterate earlier prevention and rapid rehousing, but they also talk about making sort of ending homelessness a sort of shared responsibility. So it's not just a matter of housing, it's, related to other areas, policy areas. So that's vision and the framework about how you might go about that. And then this is just a brief slide about the evidence that supports that particular policy framework. So you'll notice there's a lot of aggregate mentioned here. So there's the aggregate local authority statutory data, and then there's the aggregate annual homelessness rough sleep account. So the local authority statutory data, that originates because local authorities in the UK have a legal duty to end and prevent homelessness to various degrees. The legislation is different in each devolved region, but that's the general sort of legal thrust. They have to end and prevent homelessness. And in order to do that, then they usually have housing services, and housing services usually report their data to central government. And in Wales, that takes the form of aggregate tables. So each quarter and each annual period, they submit a set of tables that they filled in that provide counts of the number of people who've been assessed as homeless by the housing team. And the aggregate rough sleeper count is a specific exercise that they do every autumn, I think, Pete, in order, so they sort of organize this specific data collection to count the number of rough sleepers on the streets. And during COVID, they also had additional, what I think were also aggregate counts. So one of them was an estimate of the number of rough sleepers. I think they did that weekly and have now moved to monthly. And then they also produced counts of the number of people placed in temporary accommodation. Again, that was local authority level counts. So that's the sort of evidence that's publicly available. And there's lots of dotted lines linking everything, because none of these data sets actually can be cross-referenced against one another. So they're all independent, and they all sort of converge to give you a picture to some extent of people experiencing homelessness in Wales, but it's not a very clear picture. So that's the evidence base, such as it is in Wales. So we have the vision, we have the evidence base, and this is kind of, the next few slides are about how the two sort of link together. Not in actuality, but how people want them to link together. So in the strategy for preventing and ending homelessness, released in 2019, Welsh Government do sort of indicate that the current data collection isn't sufficient for what they want. They indicate that they need better understanding of the scale of homelessness. They also acknowledge that the statutory homelessness data, so the stuff that comes from local authorities, is, well, because of its very nature, it only represents people who go to the authority and are assessed by them. So there are going to be other homeless people who don't approach the authority, who we don't know about. And the only other data collection that we have is if they then start living on the streets. So there's kind of an in-betweeny bit that we don't really know about when they're not accessing services and when they're not on the streets. And they also mention, Welsh Government also mentioned the need for evidence-based interventions. And this is kind of picked up again by the Homelessness Action Group with the wonderful acronym HAG. And in the report, well, they produced a report of the policy framework needed to end homelessness. And in that, there are several, data is mentioned several times. And these are some of the points that I pulled out from the report about where data can be used, or they want data to be used. So they suggest that there's a need for an outcomes framework shared by public services. So this would be a set of indicators that's, well, outcomes frameworks can be really wordy, but usually they're accompanied by indicators to make sure that you're actually moving in the direction that the outcome framework suggests. And so those indicators are usually based on data, admin data, and so there's a need to create those indicators and then monitor them going forward. In the HAG reports, they also, the sort of team also suggests that there needs, again, it reiterates what Welsh Government said, but they sort of emphasise again that there needs to be a culture of learning and evidence-based decision-making using data. But I particularly like their statement, using data to end homelessness rather than manage it. And I think that's kind of where the sort of the data collections that came about from COVID were kind of an example of managing the situation, but not really ending it. It's the sort of knee-jerk response of, we need numbers for this. And then that sort of lends itself to aggregate data collections. So yeah, in making that statement, I think the suggestion is that we need to do more than just measure and count things. We need to do something more than that to end homelessness. That may be my overinterpretation of that. And also they suggest that we need to use it in more sexy ways, I'd say. So explore ways in which technology and data can be used to prevent homelessness. So this is about assessing people's risk of homelessness and intervening beyond the point, prior to the point where they go to local authorities for assistance. It's sort of that level of prevention rather than the prevention which we currently have, which is that they still have to go to the authority to be assessed, prevented in that sense. So those are some of the uses, hoped for and proposed uses of data. And then in the most recent document that was out for consultation, and I think the consultation ended like 4 days ago on this high-level action plan for ending homelessness. Again, it reiterates many of the points that were made in the other two documents, but it has actions at the end of this action plan. One of them is to develop a new homelessness outcome framework. So obviously that involves coming up with indicators and then monitoring those indicators. And then importantly, there is also for the first time an action that explicitly says that they're going to review and revise the data collection to support this outcomes framework. That's never been explicitly stated anywhere before, which is, you know, a nice thing to see eventually after a decade of berating them for data. Something has happened. And also good is that they're thinking about the fact that statutory data only shows you a bit of the homelessness, you know, only provides insight about people who approach those services. So they're also looking at non-statutory data. And then there's also the commitment or the action that in the medium term, then any changes to the data collection will match the legislative system. And that's one of the things that me and Pete have a bugbear about. It's the legislation changed in 2014 and came into act in 2015. But at the time, the aggregate data collection stayed the same. And there's a disjoint between what the legislation is doing and what the data collection is actually doing. And they're not, yeah, they don't. The data doesn't show you what it needs to show you. So it's good that they've actually contemplated that. So that's the big garble about, that's the end of that section. So the vision for Wales is that its homelessness is rare, brief and non-recurrent. There are certain activities that are thought to lead to this outcome, which is earlier prevention and rapid rehousing, or at least those are the things that Welsh Government are going to focus on. And data has a role within that. However, in creating a sort of evidence-based, an evidence base and in driving decisions and in also understanding the scale of homelessness. However, there's an acknowledgement that the current data isn't great. And that's where ADR Wales research comes in, because unlike the current data, which is aggregate, we have access to individual level data. And so in the remainder of this, I'm going to show you what could possibly be done with individual level administrative data. So in this section, I'm just going to go over who ADR Wales, how we get the data, what the data is, and then I'm going to go into some examples of how we've used it. So ADR Wales is a partnership between Swansea University, Cardiff University and Welsh Government. And I'm not sure if this is what we're officially about, but it sounded sort of familiar. But the aim is producing policy relevant analysis using linked de-identified administrative data. So admin data, I haven't explained what that is. It's the exhaust from an organization's day-to-day operations. So for example, health records or education data, or in this case, it would be information about households that go to housing services. In the information that local authorities collect would be considered administrative data. And also the work we do works with de-identified administrative data. that can mean various things, particularly in legislation. So de-identified in this case means that the personal data from a data set, so the name, date of birth, gender, postcode, are removed and then replaced with a unique number that identifies that person in Wales. And that number is known as the anonymised linkage field, or the ALF. And in order to do our work, we use ADR Wales uses the Secure Anonymised Information Linkage Databank based at Swansea University. Now, the next slide is scary. However, you'll be provided with the slides, so there's no need to overly worry or fixate on what I'm about to show you. This is the process of getting data into SAIL. It's important to understand how it works because it actually affects what we can do with it at the end. People often don't consider this. Also, because of the population I'm working with, then some of the things that happen when the data goes into SAIL doesn't really work with populations that are unstably housed. So it's important to understand just what's done in order to understand the output of my analysis. So I'm not going to overly focus on everything in this, but the main thing to take away is that it's the NHS number, or an encrypted version of the NHS number, that forms this unique number, which we actually link on. So data sets that have the NHS number, you're going to have a perfect match because you actually have the information that forms the anonymized linkage field. You actually have the NHS number. Where you don't have the NHS number, the SAIL process finds the NHS number by linking to something called the Welsh Demographic Service, which is essentially a big database of every address that you've ever registered with a GP at since the beginning of, I think since the 90s, I think it goes back. So when you go to a GP and register with them, they'll take your address details. All of that information, all of that address history is retained within the Welsh Demographic Service. And so this population spine is used, this data set is used to look up your NHS number by using your name, date of birth, gender, and the postcode that you provide. And then they extract the NHS number, encrypt it, and then send it on to SAIL. So it's important to note that the population spine that we use is based on GP registrations. So if you don't register for one, or if something weird and wonderful has happened to your registration with that GP, you may not have a link. So that's what I'm trying to get at here, because that's, you know, probably quite important with homeless people, because, you know, of all the people in society, something weird and wonderful is probably going to happen to them when it comes to the GP registration. So that's how data gets into SAIL. And this is, I'm going to go through some of the data sets that we have that relate to homelessness. So the first one is data. We only have data from one housing service in Wales, and it took a long time to get. And it is no longer my responsibility to get more, of which I am eternally grateful. So this data comes from the City and County of Swansea Housing Team. It relates to applications for support that closed between January 2012 and March 2017. We were initially given 17,000 cases, so 17,000 applications for support. Once it's gone through this hideous process, we then had 12,788 cases who could be linked to a unique identifier, so for whom an ALF could be assigned. So that was 75% of the original records. And there are some other idiosyncrasies with this. We were only given the identifiers, so only the names, dates of birth, and gender and postcode for the main applicant for assistance. However, there will be other people living in the household with that person who are also experiencing homelessness. And in some of the analysis that causes issues, but we've developed a workaround for that. So that's data that relates specifically to a known group of homeless people who are approaching local authorities or a local authority for assistance. We also have other ways of getting data on homeless people experiencing homelessness by using non-housing related data. So in this case, there's health data sets. So there's the patient episode database for Wales, and there's the primary care GP data set. And then there's also the substance misuse data set, which is data collected by third sector organisations funded by Welsh Government who work with people with substance use issues. And the way we can use these data they contain variables that provide information on the housing status of people. So within the health data set, there are usually health diagnoses that relate to homelessness. So if your particular condition is felt to be related to homelessness, then there are certain codes that the clinician can use to indicate that. And then in the substance misuse data set, they do actually ask people directly about their housing, about any housing related issues that they have. And they do this on 2 separate occasions. So when you're referred, they ask you about your housing situation, and then every 6 months, I think, they have treatment outcome profiles, which are basically check-ins with a person to make sure that the sort of progression is going in the way that they want it to go. And then they ask at the treatment outcome profile, they ask you, have you had housing issues in the past 4 weeks prior to the treatment outcome profile interview? Because of these data originate from healthcare providers primarily, then obviously they have the NHS number, which means that the ALF match rate is really high because they're not having to match on personal identifiers. They actually have the information there that is the basis for the ALF, which is the NHS number. So compared to 75% for the housing services data, which was linked on personal identifiers, the ALF match rate for this non-housing data is 95% and upwards. Okay, so that's the data we have, how we get it, how potentially how it's processed could affect the outcome. And in the next 5 slides, I'm going to go through some of the uses of these data, and I've framed them around the question that we're asking of the data, the method that we use, and then some finding from this particular analysis, along with a pretty graph. Okay, and I've also tried to frame them around some of the original interests or some of the proposed uses of these data that have been spouted off in the various policy documents. So understanding the scale of homelessness, conducting research into the impacts of policy, that kind of thing. So the first example we have is a piece of research about where we were trying to understand the scale of homelessness. Specifically, how many people are homeless but are not known to housing services. So in this piece of analysis, we linked the housing team data from the City and County of Swansea to the substance misuse data set and also the GP data set. We reduced the substance misuse and GP data to people who are homeless during a 2-year period, and then link that to the housing services data. And what it shows is that we could identify an additional 211 people who were homeless according to the non-housing services data, but who were not being seen by the local authority at that particular point in time. But one of the issues is obviously the low linkage rate for the housing services data could mop up those 211 people. So that's just an issue with this particular bit of analysis, but it does show that, you know, there are people who are homeless and accessing the substance misuse services that are potentially not known to the housing service at this particular time. So yeah, two different sort of outcomes from that. We know that there's more homeless people than the statutory services data is telling us, but also that some of those people are potentially more precarious or at risk than the known statutory people. In this piece of analysis, we were looking at the dynamics of homelessness. So what does homelessness look like over time? A lot of the data collection merely looks at homelessness, you know, during a particular, like it takes a snapshot of homelessness either over a period of time or at a single point in time. So the statutory data looks at homelessness that's occurred within a year, and the rough sleep account looks at homelessness on a particular night. This analysis wanted to explore, you know, what homelessness looks like over time, and it replicates quite a few studies that have been conducted in America, and I think also Denmark and Ireland, that have kind of conducted the same kind of thing. But the difference with this piece of analysis is that those other studies look at shelter use, so the placement of people in shelters, whereas the people experiencing homelessness in this analysis are people approaching local authorities. So it's quite different, and we wanted to see if the same patterns were produced. So in this one, we didn't really link the data to anything else, any other data sources. We just linked this data over time to itself. So where someone had a repeat application, they were all joined together in a sort of in a wide format. So each period of homelessness or accessing homelessness support was followed each other in a sort of long line. And we sort of joined this data together for a 4-year period. And then we conducted cluster analysis in order to group the people experiencing homelessness into patterns of service use. And so we kind of came up with 3 groups of people, which largely replicate what was found in other international studies. So we had a group of people who were accessing the housing service for short periods for on a one-off occasion during the 4-year period. So the transient group, who were potentially not homelessness as such, but accessing preventative services. Then we had the episodic group, who were accessing the housing team multiple times for sort of medium, yeah, so they were in the mid-range of length of time that they were actually receiving support. And then there's the chronic group, who were accessing the housing team for, well, short periods of, no, not short periods of time, for, they had continuous periods of support, but they only had sort of one of those over the 4-year period. So this replicated what's been found in other international studies. And the sort of interesting thing from this has been that the episodic group, so the people who are returning to housing teams multiple times during the 4-year period, are sort of potentially a measure of repeat homelessness, and therefore potentially a measure of failure to make sure that homelessness is not repeat, which is one of the sort of things that in the vision for Wales, to make sure that homelessness is non-recurrent. So that provides an potential indicator for that. In this piece of analysis, we wanted to look at the extent of substance use issues, and so we wanted to look at the overlap of substance use issues and homelessness. And this is like a first attempt at this analysis. It's not perfect because it mainly just links the housing team data with all of the people in the substance misuse services data. Ideally, further analysis will link all people who are homeless, so statutory data and the non-housing data, and then all people who have a substance use issue, so not just people who are accessing services who are actually trying to sort of resolve the issues with substance use, but also people who are hospitalized for substance use related issues. So that's the future analysis that will be conducted. But from this, we sort of linked these together and found that 10% of the adult applicants accessing the housing team were also accessing substance misuse service, or substance use service, but a higher proportion of people who were accessing the substance use service were accessing the homeless service. And we've actually had a conversation with someone from Public Health Wales about this particular output, because they're interested in the sort of the linkage between substance use and housing services, given that there seems to be quite a large chunk of people accessing the substance use services that are also receiving assistance from local authorities for housing. So that's this analysis about understanding the characteristics of experiencing homelessness through data linkage. Last but one example, in this we were looking specifically at the impacts of homelessness, and in this case, does homelessness impact school absenteeism? And it does. Homeless students were missing on average 5 days more than their non-homeless peers. And once we control for pupil characteristics, the difference still remains. In this piece of analysis, we linked the national pupil data set for Wales to the Swansea statutory housing team data. And if you remember from my description of the data, the issue here was that we only have the adult applicant. So we had to use other data sets in order to identify children who were living with those adults at the time that they were homeless. So that was the big faff with this particular analysis, that we had to sort of find who the homeless young people were by using these other data sets. And then this final piece of analysis is an example of understanding the impacts of policy. We didn't initially set out to do this, I don't think. The initial aim was just to look at prevalence rates of SARS-CoV amongst people experiencing homelessness, but it kind of churned out some interesting findings about the relationship between policy and outcomes of people experiencing homelessness. So the question here was, were people experiencing homelessness during the pandemic at a greater risk of SARS-CoV infection than the housed population? And the background for this study was that, well, I think there was a fear that the rates are going to be high amongst homeless people in the UK. But at the time, the majority of the evidence related to people in America who were using homeless shelters, which are, at the higher end of risk for a communicable disease than for homeless people in its sort of broadest sense. So the evidence base was primarily related to hostels and shelters. And statutory homelessness is more than hostels and shelters. You might be placed in a hostel and shelter, but for the statutory homeless are people who are sofa surfing or fleeing domestic violence, or who are actually housed but at risk of homelessness. So it's quite a different population. So there was that as a driver to do the research, but also the approach to rehousing people experiencing homelessness in Wales during the pandemic differed significantly from other countries. So Wales took the the UK took the approach of using self-contained accommodation rather than continuing to use hostels and shelters, but with social distancing and protective PPE in place. So the method we used was, because the statutory homelessness data that we have is quite old, we had to use health data in order to identify people experiencing homelessness during the pandemic. So once we identified those, we then linked it to SARS pathology data. So that was PCR testing and antibody testing. And then we created three comparison groups. So there was the population who weren't homeless. Then there was the population who weren't homeless but had the exact same characteristics as the homeless people. So where they lived, deprivation decile, age, gender, and also there was a propensity score match group. And in addition to that, we conducted a logistic regression to look at whether, to look at the risk of having a positive SARS-CoV test by, I think it was March the 1st, 2021. So what placed you at a higher risk of having a positive SARS-CoV test by that time, and homelessness or having experienced homelessness was one of the variables. And we controlled for, again, area level deprivation, gender, age, and local authority. And so I didn't want to put the main finding because it hasn't been published yet, but in general, the sort of gist was that people experiencing homelessness had a lower rate of lower rate of SARS-CoV infection when compared to the population. But then this difference grew. So they were so for people who were in the exact match group, so who had the exact same characteristics, then the difference between the prevalence rate was even bigger. So there was something weird going on, and so we sort of hypothesized that it may be due to the policy that Welsh Government brought in about using self-contained accommodation. So that reduces the risk of, acquiring a communicably transmitted disease. But then we also sort of hypothesized that it might be something intrinsic about being homeless. So there's reports of low social connectivity amongst people experiencing homelessness, which again, for a communicable disease, sort of slows it down if you don't have that many social connections. And also if the social connections that you have with people outside your social bubble, so people who you might interact with on the street, if those disappear, then your social connectivity really goes down. But also there's high levels of social control amongst people for people experiencing homelessness. And we sort of suggest that this is a lot higher than for the housed population. So although we were all told that we couldn't leave our houses, for a person experiencing homelessness who is completely reliant on an organisation to meet their basic needs, they are going to be subject to a hell of a lot more social control than people told to go hide in their homes, who were probably doing very naughty and COVID safe things. Whereas if you're in a hostel and if you're in an accommodation that's controlled by someone else, you are subject to those levels of control, and you're probably subject to them for far longer than everyone else was, because we could all go out and play, but you know, these forms of accommodation were probably watched for far longer than everyone else. So all of these factors probably combined to lower the prevalence rate amongst homeless people. And I use the word, do I use the word protective factors? That sounds a bit nice, but all the things that sort of lowered the prevalence rate were probably incredibly horrible. So it's not really protective in that sense. So I'm just going to whiz through the issues that are faced and how they could be addressed. I'm not going to go through data acquisition. I'm fed up of talking about that. It's a nightmare, and it's someone else's nightmare. So I'm just going to stick to the issues that I encountered during the analysis. So one of the big issues with the statutory data was obviously a no alpha match. So 75%, we could find who the person was. 25% of cases, we didn't know who they were. That's fine, but the issue here is we don't know the cause. Because this happens in Digital Health and Social Care Wales, which is a bit of a black box, then we can't really account for why this is happening. Some sort of reasons why it might be happening is because the quality of the data collected by the authority was poor, in which case there's nothing I can do. It's just there needs to be guidance on data collection, just to impress the importance of data linkage, and that, you know, these data do help in order to conduct this kind of analysis. Something else that might help is the change in the processes about how Digital Health and Social Care Wales communicate match links to SAIL. So, you know, I'd be particularly interested in, was it because no address history was provided, or what elements of data weren't provided to Digital Health and Social Care Wales that led to this poor match rate? An alternative, there could be, for this particular kind of population, just matching on variables that don't change too much over time. So age, gender, sex, and date of birth. Addresses may change over time because they probably have unstable housing, but the things that are stable, you know, linkage on those could help increase the match rate with this population. The other issue, as I highlighted with the educational analysis, was that there's a lack of personal identifiers for all people experiencing homelessness in the household. So with the statutory data, this was probably just because the data were quite old, and I think local authorities do collect personal identifiers about all household members now. I think they've cottoned on to the fact because, yeah, they've had to do other data linkage exercises. So I think they appreciate they need to know who other people are in the household. So this mainly relates to the health data. So if you go to a GP and they record you as having a homelessness related diagnosis, they're not going to take the information of the people you live with, and so we have to infer it from other data sets. But we have methods in ADRW for identifying co-resident household members, so we can address that in a researchy kind of situation fairly easily and fairly accurately. Other issues, so differences in how homelessness is measured and recorded across data sources. So there's two things here. There's health events versus periods of support. So health data are about, you know, you're ill, this is a one-off event, there's no start and end date to the homelessness, you're just recorded as being homeless on this date. Statutory data, you have a start and end date. So the various things you can do is just treat it all as events. So if you approach a local authority when you're assessed as homeless, that is just the event, and we just ignore the fact that it has an end date. Or you can create an indicator for a period of time, which is what I'm doing with other analysis. So are you receiving support during the 2018-19 financial year? And so you can kind of combine sort of periods and events within that indicator. The other issue is that the different data sets record homelessness differently. So sometimes you have homeless very vaguely, sometimes you have specific homeless events. I shall wrap up soon. So there's no way around this other than just to look at homelessness in its broader sense. And taking a broader definition of homelessness rather than trying to focus specifically on certain types of homelessness. And then there's also the issues around the service-driven nature of data collections. So this is admin data, so it reflects administrative data systems, and it kind of may lead to bias because you're only focusing on people approaching those systems. So the easiest way around this is to engage in data linkage and sort of to combine multiple data sources. So you get different perspectives on what are the homeless population. Quickly. So yeah, this is just to summarize where data could fit into the policy framework. So it could improve the measurement of the scale of homelessness, but also look at the dynamics of homelessness. It could develop tailored policy responses through detailed analysis of characteristics. Currently, you can't drill down into aggregate data beyond the things that it's been aggregated at, whereas with individual level data that I've been using in ADR analysis, you can combine it in multiple different ways. But then more importantly, there's also potential to engage in the evaluation of policy and practice, which is something that, although you can do now, you can't do it easily. It takes time, and potentially by the time you've got your answers, then you're kind of, it's too late, or, too much time has passed. And then one quick 30-second waffle. So, not a fan of the sort of verbosity of Malcolm Williams's sort of commentary, but I do like this statement. So essentially, there are no necessary conditions, there are only sufficient ones. So rather than suggesting that you need to do this analysis, you need individual level data in order to achieve these changes, it helps. And it helps us move us towards the point that we want, which is ending homelessness. And it helps us do that probably a bit more quickly than the use of aggregate data, because you can combine individual level data into different uses. And so I'd suggest that because you can increase the number of uses, then the chances are that some of those uses will lead to positive changes. Then.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ian. Marvelous. Right, we've got 9 minutes for questions, so I'm not going to talk a second. Let's see hands up for any questions. I'll just bring you in. Yes, Sally, I saw a hand and then you moved. Sally, go for it.
Yeah. No, thanks very much. It's clearly very complicated, and this is it's really about the characteristics of the homeless people themselves, and and what you can say. And again, this is not my area, for instance, and how that relates to other policy areas. So if a significant number of people who are homelessness, however you get the data, are, for instance, refugees or asylum seekers, or, I mean, I don't know, because you obviously you haven't had the time, whether you know much about the demographics of them and how that would relate to other policy decisions in other areas than housing.
Yeah, so the paper where I count the homeless people by combining different data sets, when I write that up as a paper, I'm going to actually break down the demographics to show, if you just look at people who approach this service, this is what homelessness looks like. But then if you approach people, if you look at the characteristics of people from this service, this is what it looks like. Is there a difference? And then the implications of that. So I'm gonna discuss that through that particular paper by doing that, the more detailed breakdowns. Yeah.
Thanks, Ian. Rika.
So I would say that for the future, if you could give some descriptive statistics of who are overrepresented in, like, I noticed that you couldn't find matches for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So if you could give some, if you could somehow visualize that who you could match and who you couldn't match, so that would be helpful for the audience. Other question is about this Welsh approach in general, that so it's considered as a public service issue, not as a housing supply issue. Is this really correct?
I'll defer to Pete.
The primary drivers of homelessness are pretty much the same wherever you are. That's supply of housing and its poverty. So they're primary drivers. But then who actually becomes homeless later down the line is a combination of all factors that relate to often individual identity, household formation, and other risk factors.
Right.
And so, but the duty in terms of responding if somebody is at risk of or becomes homeless, and it's a legal duty, is on the local authority. So the local authority has to act rather than it being on the place of the individual. So that's how it works in Wales.
I see. The thing is that I'm Finnish, and in Finland we are tackling homelessness by providing housing first, which does make sense, but then that is connected, very much connected to the housing supply.
And a social welfare system that is marvelous. Finland is actually the only place in pretty much globally where homelessness is reducing until the last 2 years, actually. But yes, it's housing first, it's housing led. Housing First works with a very particular cohort of homeless households. So Housing First is for those with really complex needs. The homelessness system in Wales, and that's what Ian was describing, works with a much wider homeless population. So families who don't have complex needs but are at risk of losing their property for the really poor rental market. We've got
I would actually think that in the Welsh context it would make more sense to focus on the housing supply, because so many homeless are people who don't have like very severe issues. Like in Finland, those who are homeless, like well, I don't say they are completely hopeless, but they do have very, very severe issues.
Yeah. I mean, when Finland counts homelessness, they also include folk that are kind of precariously housed. They use a really wide definition now, but Housing First works with a very particular group who face complex needs. But yeah, perhaps we can carry that conversation on. In fact, a presentation on Finland would be great, but let's carry that one on a wee bit after. Anybody else want to come in with a comment or a question? Yeah, Katie.
So I was thinking about the substance misuse data and how that works in practice, in terms of, do they refer people to housing services and do they not? And if they don't, why aren't they doing that? And did that come up in your PHW meeting?
I'm not sure. I would hope common sense would say that they'd prefer, but we don't have. They don't have onward referrals. They only have information about how you were referred into the substance misuse service. So I can potentially look at referrals from housing to substance misuse, but I can't really look at it from the other way.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Like, as practice, do they, if somebody presents them as homeless, you would think that they would then go and tell the housing services in that local authority that they did.
Yeah.
And if that's not happening, why is that not happening? And it should. And then, but there might be issues of consent, that the people who are accessing the services don't consent to them passing on that information. There might be kind of legal issues around that.
Yeah.
And then one other thing, you mentioned non-statutory sources, and is that things like charities, or have you got other sources in mind that you might want to work with?
So at the moment it's just the health substance misuse data sets, but yeah, charities would be, because again they deal with, I mean, Shelter does a lot of things with people who've been at the sticky end of local authorities' actions. So again, they have like a different perspective again, but also shelters don't really crop up anywhere in any data collection other than their own. I mean, we know about people placed in shelters by local authorities, but people who self-present at a shelter wouldn't be known.
And I presume those local authorities don't kind of follow that on with what are the outcomes of that placement in that we've placed you in a shelter and now you're off our list and we're going to the next person, rather than we'll catch up with you again in 6 months and see if you're still there or if you've progressed?
They know, so they'll have an end date for the placement in temporary accommodation, and then they'll have a case closure outcome. But again, it's not really probative. It's like, we close this, we deem it positive. They weren't likely to be homeless in, was it 6 months? Again, they don't actually have to follow them. It's just their assessment of the likelihood that the person won't become homeless in 6 months. So yeah, there's a whole heap of not great data collection being done. But yeah, the bare bones are there.
Brilliant. Thanks all. I'm conscious that we've hit time and people are having to go. You're getting rounds of applause in the comments, Ian. I think what you've been able to do is give us such a great overview of a really broad program of work, which I know you've had to fight very hard even to get that data available. So a huge thanks. Look, if folk want to go and pick Ian's brains, or if you've got on the more policy side of questions, Rika, then I'm happy to chat. Just get in touch. But it was great. A huge thanks to Ian, and thanks to everyone for coming along as well. Some great numbers attending.